And welcome back to the Book Club, and we're joined now by Carne Ross, who has written The Leaderless Revolution, How Ordinary People Will Take Power and Change Politics in the 21st Century. Hi, Carne.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
No, it's a great pleasure. And Carne, you were a senior diplomat. You quit after giving evidence to the Butler inquiry on the Iraq War. Mm-hmm. You were the UK's WMD link over Iraq. You've now set up independent diplomats. Mm-hmm. Diplomacy?
Yeah, independent diplomat, yeah.
Independent diplomat, which is a consultancy. So you were right in the Foreign Office at the heart of it during that incredible period.
Yeah, I was our Iraq specialist at the UN Security Council for 4.5 years. I was our liaison with the weapons inspectors, and indeed one of the 2 places in the world where we had direct contact with the Iraqis. So I'd be talking to the Iraqi government. So, yes, on that particular piece of policy, I did know a fair bit.
And you negotiated ISAF, the International Security and Assistance Force in Afghanistan?
Yeah, after 9/11, they gave me Afghanistan as well as Iraq. So I had all the fun projects. It was good.
So why did you chuck all that in?
It was a very painful decision because I chucked it in because, I mean, I wasn't particularly heroic about it. I only resigned in 2004. Didn't resign when the war took place, and I resigned after giving evidence to the Butler inquiry, and I just felt I gave evidence in secret because I wanted to protect my career in the Foreign Office. I was just about to become a head of department, and I thought about it after sending in this evidence, and I thought, actually, I just can't go back to the Foreign Office. I can't do it anymore. I don't actually respect my ministers anymore. So I resigned, and the reason was my evidence was very critical. It went through all the details of our Iraq policy, you know, the stuff that is now very familiar. The government exaggerated the case for war, it ignored decent alternatives to war, and it trampled on the resolutions, many of which I'd helped negotiate.
Even if you were told you're going to give your evidence in secret, did you ever really believe that it would remain secret?
Butler's people gave me absolute assurance that it would be kept secret, and I'm not listed as a witness to the inquiry. There's 2 anonymous witnesses, and I'm one of those. And they were very professional and discreet about it. So, in a sense, yeah. On the other hand, if you read that evidence, if you ever saw that evidence, it could only have come from one person.
So, in a way, you get those assurances, but you know what you say.
I think when I wrote the evidence, I kind of knew it was my kind of suicide note from the Foreign Office. I knew that it was the breaking point. It was an emotional thing because I really loved being in the Foreign Office. It was a great job. And I felt in a way, which I think many people going through this, resigning from their professions feel. I felt like I was betraying my colleagues, which felt awful.
Now, you draw on all that in this book, in The Leadership Revolution, where you admit money and power control people's lives. You quote those figures. Sort of 2 billion people a day in the world live on less than $2 a day. Even in Western liberal democracies like our own, people feel excluded. They don't feel empowered. They don't feel in control. Mm-hmm. And yet, in this great vortex, you have a certain optimism.
Yeah. I mean, it's a sort of optimism born of despair, if that doesn't sound ironic. I mean, that moment when I quit over Iraq was a moment of real despair. I had really become totally disillusioned with what I'd been doing in government. I'd actually become disillusioned with government. I felt that in my work, we never really properly understood the places we were dealing with, and yet we claimed to. And also, I had this growing feeling that the outputs of the system, the democratic system, were not particularly good. You know, we weren't dealing with the big problems of the day that we faced. We face them today: climate change, terrorism, rampant inequality, and yet everybody was just kind of shrugging their shoulders, saying this is just the way it is. This is modern capitalism. And I just felt, well, that's not really good enough. That's not enough. That's not satisfactory to me. But what would be a better political system? And that is the journey that began 10 years ago and resulted in the book that you've got in front of you now, which was a kind of exploration, a personal journey of what is a politics that might really work, what would actually really produce outputs, concrete solutions to these problems. So it is an optimistic book because I actually believe that we have it in our hands to solve these things. But we've got to act to do it. It won't be governments who do it for us.
You're listening to the LBC 97.3 Book Club with me, Kevin Maguire, and Carne Ross, the author of The Leadership Revolution, How Ordinary People Will Take Power... the Leaderless Revolution, How Ordinary People Will Take Power and Change Politics in the 21st Century. And just to let you know, we're with you until 10. Then coming up at 10, Anthony Davis will be asking whether you would watch a court case on TV after it was reported tonight that David Cameron is poised to allow some court sentencing to be televised. Also, the riots that swept across the UK were the result of a penal system that fails to stop a feral underclass reoffending, the Justice Secretary said tonight. Does he have a point? And children in many countries, including Kazakhstan, Albania and Estonia, enjoy reading more than youngsters in the UK, research suggests. So what is our favourite pastime? All that and more with Anthony Davis from 10 o'clock. And on the subject of reading, Con, you've drawn... you've romped through history in your book, and you draw inspiration from the Spanish Civil War, the volunteers who went to fight there in the international brigades, including from Britain, Burma, Aung San Suu Kyi, the democracy movement there. But how can we pull them all together, as it were? And actually, people do feel powerless.
Well, this is what the book attempts to do. It attempts to offer a way forward to give people a method. It's not declaring a utopia of what the end state of that process should be, what the world should look like according to Carne Ross. It's not that at all. It's just a humble proposal of method. What is the way to go about your politics that might actually work? And it's very straightforward. It's, act, find something you really care about, locate your convictions, which God knows is sometimes pretty hard these days. Then act upon them, collaborate with others, consult those most affected, which is a crucial thing which usually doesn't happen, frankly, with any policy making by distant governments or international institutions. And your action will ramify. It will ripple throughout the system. What network theorists are finding today is that social change can happen much, much faster than it happened before. We've seen this in different contexts, from the spread of suicide bombing to the Arab Spring. Political change can actually happen very quickly, but it's not going to happen on its own. You've got to do things, but the really exciting thing is your behaviour may now be transmitted even across the world very quickly.
The Arab Spring, very, very, very good example with your book. Change is possible if people act. You look at Libya.
Yeah.
How do you respond to what's happening there? And you heard David Cameron talking today, or you may have heard David Cameron talking today about how Britain and NATO played a pivotal part. It wasn't just people in Libya, there was outside intervention.
Yeah, it's very true. And I supported the intervention once it became clear that Gaddafi was going to crush the revolt in Benghazi, in doubtless a very cruel way. But I've argued about Libya that long before the revolt, we should have been isolating the Gaddafi regime. We should be using non-violent methods to undermine the regime, which I analyse in the book, including isolation, boycott and sabotage, which can be done non-violently. I think our government should have no truck with these kind of regimes. It's very clear that we should be supporting democracy movements everywhere they occur. That is the best way to long-term stability. It's also the best way to fight threats like terrorism. So I think that actually there is a very different course which doesn't necessarily need to require NATO intervention to sort it out. It's a very drastic step. It's extremely risky. I don't think Cameron knew at any point that it was going to work until right the last minute. I don't think the rebels knew that. They hoped it, but it was a very dicey undertaking, and it always is when you undertake a war.
There's a long streak of optimism in the book, and occasionally idealism. Did you feel that when you were in the Foreign Office, or does it get buried by what realpolitik, the reality is what your political masters are telling you to do, and then you can flower once you're out?
Well, I was very idealistic. I was a student politician. I led demonstrations. I campaigned for against apartheid. I led pickets of our local Shell station, which was involved in South Africa, stuff like that. I was a very political beast. I was very idealistic as a young diplomat. I really felt that being in the Foreign Office was a way to change things. And it often can be. I'm not at all hostile to my former colleagues or indeed to the institution. But what happened to me, and I worked on some very difficult, serious issues. I worked on several wars. I ended up working on Iraq and Afghanistan, and of course terrorism. I was in New York for 9/11, and I think by the last few years of my career, I began to realise that what I was doing was completely contrary to my own values. All the things that I had believed in before were not what I was doing. I mean, I was a very big part of sanctions against Iraq, which undoubtedly did enormous harm to the civilian population of Iraq, and I was responsible for that. I mean, I think, all the way down through a system we're responsible. It's not fair just to blame it on the ministers taking the decision. You do what you do, and you should be responsible for it. But I felt that, somehow I'd been sort of almost literally demoralised, that I'd kind of lost my conscience. And that was a terrible moment. I felt that I'd become kind of something that I didn't really like, that I didn't believe in. And leaving enabled me to rediscover my political passions and also kind of examine a very practical way to actually give life to them. And that led to the book.
Is that inevitable if you join an establishment body like the Foreign Office? Like, you as an individual will just be subsumed, and they will take you over. You may feel frustrated, you may feel constrained, but there's very little you can do about it when you're there on the inside.
I'm afraid I think it is inevitable, and I say that with the greatest respect to my colleagues there, many of whom I really like and admire. But at the end of the day, you're a servant. You do what the government of the day tells you. And I looked at the top people in my profession, my ambassadors, my boss, in various different contexts, and I thought, you would do almost anything they'd tell you. And one particular ambassador, we went through a lot together, me and him, and we did a complete U-turn on a piece of policy that I really cared a lot about. It was about Israel and Palestine. And, we did a U-turn on policy. Our instructions changed overnight from London. And I was very upset about it. And he came into my office, and he was just like carrying on completely as normal. And I just felt, where is your emotion about this? This stuff should upset you. You should feel passionate about it. You shouldn't be completely dispassionate, which the ultimately professional diplomat is. I mean, diplomacy is a very weird business where it is celebrated not to care, where it is celebrated to be almost like a machine where you're uttering the interests of your state and you negotiate and arbitrate them with other states. And there's something very inhuman about that. And not that, my bosses were inhuman. A lot of them are very, very humane, decent people. But I felt professionally they had become almost inhuman.
Right, you're listening to the LBC 97.3 Book Club with me, Kevin Maguire, and former senior British diplomat Carne Ross, author of The Leaderless Revolution. But it's 9:46, so we'll go to the travel with Alan Joyce.
Thanks, Kevin. And firstly, some better...
And you're listening to the LBC 97.3 Book Club with me, Kevin Maguire, and former senior British diplomat Carne Ross, who's the author of The Leaderless Revolution, How Ordinary People Will Take Power and Change Politics in the 21st Century. And, Carne, you have a chapter, Why Chess is an Inappropriate Metaphor for International Relations, Why Jackson Pollock's Paintings Are a Better One, but Still Inadequate. Can you explain that? Because in foreign affairs, it's often described as a game of chess.
Yeah, and it's complete crap. I mean, it's not a game of chess, and calling it a game of chess implies a comprehensibility and a predictability about it which simply doesn't exist. And I think it plays into the whole myth that, only highly skilled chess players, diplomats, can do it. Statesmen are given this sort of immense status in society, when a lot of it, frankly, is rolling a dice and hoping for the best, because the world is more and more complex. It's more and more resembles a Jackson Pollock picture rather than a chess game. And a Jackson Pollock picture doesn't capture its complexity. It's a endlessly interactive system where billions and billions of parts are responding to each other in real time constantly. How do you predict cause and effect, or even understand cause and effect in a system like that? And that's really kind of the premise of the whole book is, what is the politics that works for a system like that? That's not a chessboard, that's not straightforward, where states don't dominate it, where they're losing power and influence. And the answer is actually almost counterintuitive. It's actually a politics where the individual agent, the atom in that system, is the most influential part of it. An old word for it is anarchism, in a sense, and
Yeah, you draw on that, don't you? I was surprised. I wasn't expecting that.
Well, I was surprised too that was the conclusion I ultimately came to, because the process of the book was very much looking at the world and working out what politics would work for it, because a government-dominated system was not working. People are very frustrated with even democratic representative government. People don't feel part of the decisions there that are made about their lives, which was, a political phenomenon I'd seen elsewhere in the Balkans, and I'd seen it lead to violence. And one senses this in Western democracies, enormous frustration. So what's the answer? And the answer came to me that basically it's individuals acting according to their convictions, transmitting change throughout the system. That is actually something that complexity theory has already discovered about complex systems, that change can ripple through them very fast. And so I drew on complexity theory and network theory to talk about this idea in the book. But it's basically grounded in real politics and real life situations like Kosovo, like what's going on in Britain and also America today.
But really, all those individuals, even if they're kind of acting together, can they really counter big corporations, big governments? Can you really have that leaderless revolution?
Well, I think the first thing is to stop believing that governments and big corporations can have it all of their own way. I think the biggest obstacle is the way we think. And I think, we have been conditioned into thinking that we are powerless, when in fact we are the most powerful agent of change. We're far more powerful than any government. We're far more influential on each other. Our peers are far more influential upon us than any expert or certainly any government policy. So we've got extraordinary power. But we've been told to think there are all kinds of problems and issues that we have no power in. International relations, global issues, blah, blah, blah. And in fact, we are the most potent agent of change in all of them. And actually, governments are less and less potent. And governments are realising this, but they don't have the answer.
But they act as if they do, as if they're in control.
Yeah. And I was a speechwriter for 2 foreign secretaries. I wrote these speeches saying we've got it all in hand. And it's not true. They're rolling the dice in ministries all over Whitehall, wondering what the hell's going to happen, because they cannot predict change in a complex system. Top-down change is very difficult to achieve in a system like that. What works is bottom-up change, where individual agents decide to change things for themselves.
Is bottom-up change always positive, or can it be negative?
It can be very negative. It can be very unpleasant, and I've seen it break out in Kosovo. I saw violent anarchy. And that's, of course, not what I'm talking about. But I looked at various social science experiments where they put large numbers of people in a room together to make decisions about their circumstances, and that works. And it's worked in Brazil, it's worked in New Orleans, it's being done in Bradford, where you have mass participation in budgetary decision-making, which is basically government, and the outcomes are much better than the outcomes we're used to. There's much more consensus, respect for facts, respect for each other, and the outcomes are fairer because they include everybody. Whereas at the moment, even in representative democracies, the outcomes are skewed towards the rich and the powerful.
You quote a phrase, "a new world disorder," which Timothy Garton Ash, a writer, used. Maybe somebody else used it before him, but he certainly used it, and you attribute it to him. Where do you think this new world disorder will be in, say, 10 years' time?
I think we're in an extraordinary moment in human history where things could go really, really badly. Climate change, terrorism, apocalypse is possible. But it could also go really, really well if we act responsibly, and we act, that we don't just wait for these things to happen or wait for governments to sort it out. And I think these moments are rare. I sense, you can almost feel it in the air, and you certainly feel it in the US, where I live, but you also feel it around the world, this sense of an almost generational shift, perhaps even an epochal shift in the way we think about politics, because people are getting it. The governments cannot sort out these globalised problems. Intrinsically, they're not able to. Therefore, we need a different way of politics, and people are realising that signing an internet petition is not enough. You've got to actually go and do it yourself.
You think it'd be so momentous? There is the potential for absolutely fundamental change.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's extraordinary that I came to that conclusion, because I normally see myself as quite cynical and sort of, that's never going to work.
The book's not cynical, though.
No, it's not at all.
The book is hopeful, and it is optimistic.
Because I really believe it. I mean, I really believe that you put all of this together, you put all of this analysis and research together, and you can actually make things happen. I mean, I think partly I feel that because of my own life. I was very much into a government-dominated world. God knows I worked for government. I expelled myself from government. I had nothing, lost my job, lost my wages, lost my career. And, I set up this thing, Independent Diplomat, on my own, from nothing, from the basement of my flat in Kennington. And it's become something. It's not huge, but it's something, and you can make stuff happen, and it has a political effect. It's made a difference to the diplomatic processes where we've been advising the marginalised peoples and countries we help. South Sudan, Kosovo, the small island states in the climate process. We've made a difference to these people. And I'm not only proud of that, but it's also shown me that actually if you start doing stuff, you can actually make a difference. And that's been an extraordinary lesson to me.
It has, and it shines out in that book. Thank you very much, Carne. That's Carne Ross, former senior British diplomat, author of The Leaderless Revolution, How Ordinary People Will Take Power and Change Politics in the 21st Century. It's published by Simon & Schuster. It's just out. It's £16.99. And Carne does have an optimistic look on life. Now, that's me done for the day. Coming up next is Anthony Davis.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Yes, join me right after the news, and we'll continue London's biggest conversation with David Cameron poised to allow some court sentencing to be televised. It was reported tonight. I'll be asking, would you watch a court case on TV? And the riots that swept across the UK were the result of a penal system that fails to stop a feral underclass. These are the words of Kenneth Clarke, our Justice Secretary. But what does he mean by a feral underclass? And does he have a point? 0845 6060 973 is the number to call. This is LBC 97.3.